Hi, I'm John Atack and my very dear friend Joe Szimhart. And we're going to talk about art and appearance and cults, something that some people call cults. Not really quite sure what that word means anymore. But and you started out by telling me about Cy Twombly in a mural. So tell us that story.
Yeah, it's recent. Twombly did a mural that I'm pretty sure if I get it right, it's on the ceiling of the Louvre, one of the buildings, the outbuildings. And the architect, since that mural was put on, an architect changed the interior, and it looks different in color and its aesthetics. And Twombly's estate got offended by this because it changed the look of the mural. Context changes everything, just like a word. If you put a word in one sentence, it's very different than when you put it in another sentence.
Yeah.
And we can look at the word cult, for instance. Its context changes with the speaker and the sentence and the paragraph that it's in. So Twombly's estate sued to force the architects to restore the original look of the building, the interior, so the artwork would look the same as the artist intended. And of course, the suit didn't go anywhere because it's private property and they could do any damn thing they want with the interior, paint it red if they want. And the artwork be damned as far as its sensitivity and its aesthetics and all of that stuff, that goes with it. And then there's the other question. The public that comes to view this art can adapt to the new environment and rearrange it in their minds to look okay in there. So it's an individual aesthetic choice when it comes down to it. It's not the choice of the work of art or the artist in the end. It's the viewer that decides whether this fits or not, in the end, correct? So we get into a very strange territory here. And I also was talking to you about the idea of professional wrestling, which, people think of as fake choreographed, acrobatic, Marvel Comics kind of thing, but it's usually popular. And some people view it as more reality than unreality. Other people view it as pure entertainment. And then there's a whole segment of people that find it very offensive, that they're lying to people. They're acting like they're fighting and they're not really fighting. So you have that whole spectrum. I told my wife this story. When I was a young therapeutic activities worker at a large institution for mentally ill and what they used to call retarded and brain damaged people, or intellectually disabled or deficient. So this one psychologist and I took 4 of these young men that were a little bit higher functioning, and they were IQ around 60, if you measure intelligence, but they were permanently institutionalized at the time. And we took them to a professional wrestling match in Philadelphia, and it was a second-rate but entertaining venue with a few thousand people cheering and all of that going on. And one of the young black men that was with me, he was in his 20s, and he had a low IQ, but he's observing all this very carefully. And about the middle of it, he turns to me and he says, "Joe," he says, "I don't think this is real." And so I started to explain to him about the choreography, in simple terms, and he started to get it. This man in front of us heard me talking, and he turned around with an alarmed look on his face and said, "You mean you don't think this is real?" And I looked at the psychologist down the line, and I kind of backed off from talking because I thought I was going to end up with an argument with this guy who paid money to see real wrestling, So, I wonder sometimes what the human brain does in terms of its context and experience when we're inside of a new religion. When we think we found something new and special, when we're entertained by it, when it makes us feel somehow experientially evolved or whatever, and where does that line between real and unreal get drawn? We've talked about this before, but I'm trying to look at it in different contexts, from aesthetics and from performance. Wrestling is a performance art, and everything from Olympic wrestling, which is regulated and it's a true competition in that sense, to this form carnival kind of stuff that goes on in professional wrestling. It's fascinating to me. So I'm wondering, some culture like professional wrestling, other culture like Olympic wrestling, and all of it's all made up. We made up the idea of wrestling. It's competition to improve the warrior, to make him stronger, to give him better fighting skills. So there's a purpose to it. But at the same time, it became an entertainment venue. And it wasn't about killing the opponent. It was about defeating the opponent without harming him in any serious way. So anyway, I'll let you go at that, see where we go with this conversation.
I mean, it burrows very deeply into the way we perceive the world and the nature of consciousness and all of these questions. To get into trouble immediately, which is something I'm well known for. If we look at the Torah, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, we know historically where it comes from. Excuse me. It tells us where it comes from. Abraham comes from Ur, and this is the origin of the religion. So he comes from the Ur city, the beginning of, in Mesopotamia, between the two rivers of civilization. He comes out of Babylon, which is the successor to the Sumerian civilization. Now, of course, in the last 150 years or so, an enormous amount of material has been brought out of the sands and put into museums and studied. And we have found the original versions of many of the stories which would become the Bible. Now, the Bible is regarded by some as literal truth. Jews, Christians, Muslims, and other little sects that have come off the side of it revere this book as I've heard it called the received word of God by an Anglican minister who got very angry with somebody for saying they preferred the King James Bible. And he said, you can't, you've got to have a modern translation that's absolutely accurate. It's so important because it's the received word of God. However, when we look at some of these stories, we can find, we know historically that I think there are two proto-texts, one probably dating to about the 9th century BC and one probably to the 6th or 7th century BC. And these two texts come together to form Torah. Now, there are problems already because these two texts differ from each other. So in one of them, Adam is the last created thing. And in the other of them, Adam is the first created thing who helps God to name everything. And these two things run alongside in this book, which is literally true. However, when we go back to Babylon, we find these ring seals, these beautiful little things, which tell us stories. When you put them together in sequence, you find, for example, the idea of the Garden of Eden. And there are particular ring seals which show the goddess, because, of course, the goddess was Asherah. And in the Babylonian, she is the mother of Yahweh, Jehovah, who is one of, I think, 72 gods and goddesses who are the children of Asherah. The Christians call her Astaroth now. She's a demon, a devil, but she was long ago the mother of Jehovah or Yahweh, who was a war god within the Babylonian pantheon. We know these things. They've been discovered, but they're in conflict with what is believed. Now, she is seen welcoming humanity, Adam and Eve, Adam, of course, meaning man, the first man, into the Garden of Eden, where they will eat dates, because there were no apples in that part of the world. They hadn't come out of Afghanistan yet.
I think they were figs.
Oh, okay. Could be figs. Could be figs. There we go. So already we've got two sects have come out of this. We've got.
Remember the parable of the fig tree that Jesus talked about. So the fig is important in this story. But
and fig leaves as well, of course. You know,
fig leaves. Yes, there you go.
It looks like a date palm to me in the seal, but you know, okay. I could be misinterpreting, and therefore I may go to hell for not having understood this properly. But she is welcoming humanity into the garden, not expelling them. And the creature doing the welcoming is the snake, who is a representative of the Father God. So how we take this story and what happens to it over the years, we know that Ezra, after the release from captivity in the 5th century BC from the Babylonians, creates what we would call Judaism. You know, it's a much later creation. If you look into the 2nd book of Kings, which is in the Bible, it says right there that King Josiah, and we can date him because he's in the Egyptian Chronicles, it's around the year 620 BC, he finds out they're worshipping the wrong gods. And the temple, the priestesses are thrown out, and he's found the book of the law. And so there are these transitions, all of these inventions, all of these stories. And so it would be fair to say, I think, that all of our belief systems are made up. And it is then a question of whether we're allowed to change the decoration around them, or indeed whether we can do in its time, the most famous painting in the world was the Battle of Anghiari by Leonardo da Vinci. And it was in the Hall of the 400 in Florence. And it was decided, you know, you've just taken over a new place, you kind of think, well, we need to change the decor a bit. So the councillors of Florence decided they didn't like this painting, even though the artists from all over Europe were traveling to see this astonishing work, the biggest Da Vinci ever painted, bigger than the Last Supper, I believe. This astonishing painting. And the Council of 400 decided they'd have Giorgio Vasari paint over it. And so what you see in the Council, the Hall of the 400 now, are these huge and rather dull paintings by Vasari. But we also know that Vasari, I can't remember, I think it was a Masaccio of Christ in Glory, which is Christ on a throne in a wonderful red robe. It could be a Mantegna. My M's get confused sometimes. But we know that Vasari, when he was asked to paint over that, built brick columns in front of it and a wall, and it's been recovered. And there is no way, given what Vasari wrote in the Lives of the Artists about Da Vinci, that he would ever have destroyed a Da Vinci. So it's probably still in there somewhere. And I think the other reflection is that every generation, whether it likes to or not, reinvents its beliefs. So when we look at Haredi, they don't like being called ultra-Orthodox, but it's what people call them. Ultra-Orthodox Jews with the ringlets and hats and what have you. They're actually, I think, a late 17th century sect. The costumes they wear don't actually date back to Moses. They are perpetuating a form of dress, a dress code that belonged to that time, and same with the Amish.
Yeah, right. I was thinking of the Amish also, which is only several centuries, old, and these aren't old traditions. There's no going back to an original Christian look. There is just no such thing going on, even though some of the cults attempt that.
Yeah, I mean, I read there's a wonderful book called The Islamist by Ed Hussein, and he was recruited into an Islamist, militant, violent sect in London. And he said that they would go out to Syria, some of them, and they'd dress in a particular way, the little hat and the beard and all of this stuff. And when they got to Syria, they found that the only people that dressed this way were the Christians.
Yeah.
So, and the adoption of the veil, of course, which is not found anywhere in the Quran. It's adopted from Jews who've converted, and there is this terrible genetic rumor at the moment that in fact the Palestinians are the original inhabitants of Judea and Israel, and they converted to Islam. And the people who've gone to Israel are largely Khazars from Eastern Europe. But oh, there's a fight we could get into with lots of people.
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence the hijab, the covering, is early Christian that was adopted later by the Muslim faith. Yeah,
I've read that it comes from a Jewish tradition, which in turn is adopted from the Athenian tradition, that during the great period of democracy in Athens, women were kept indoors and they had to wear the veil when they went outside, which in turn was adopted from the Assyrians. So methods of oppressing women one way or another, or making sure that people can't see your wife or wives, it goes back quite a way. But
it's interesting too, talking about those aesthetics. I've spent a little bit of time in Dubai and saw the Emirate look, and there's varieties of veils and masks and stuff that women wear there that are considered orthodox Muslim, and you can flip this, and again from within the culture you look at as protecting women from the lust of men, and some women actually prefer that
I've heard women saying that.
They don't like men ogling them all the time.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. So it's not a clear-cut case of abuse or suppression. It's some kind of a fig leaf, that Adam and Eve become aware of their lusty parts, and they had to cover up, and in order to prevent that part of their nature from misbehaving.
It becomes
you can see it from that point of view, right?
I can, and I've heard Afghan women talking about feeling safer because they're wearing the burqa. On the other,
I've heard modern women here in America saying they feel safer wearing the mask during COVID because it gives them some anonymity. That let's say they are somewhat famous and on television, and when they have that on, people don't know who they are when they're out on the streets.
The same is true for burglars, of course. I think it becomes oppression when you're forced to do it.
Yes.
And there isn't a disease around that's making you do it. And it certainly looking at, that in Saudi Arabia, women have, I think in the last 5 years, been allowed to drive cars.
Yes, actually, it's been longer than that. In the rural areas, there were women driving cars all along because they had to. There was not enough men to do these things, to run the children to hospital or whatever. But in the more controlled urban areas, that's where the look of the nation is more seen, with cameras and people around and all of that. So there's more religious police around, controlling that sort of thing. That's from what I understood. So, this whole there have been women driving, for reasons of necessity in that culture. But
women were being arrested in the cities.
They had to be careful where they went. Yeah.
And so it's an interesting balance. We come into cultural context and the idea of what we're meant to do. The reality, I had somebody who was discussing with me some principle of Christianity that I talked about, and it was interesting that it came to what is literal and what are you meant to do. So when Jesus, for example, says, if your right eye offends you, pluck it out. If your right hand offends you, cut it off. Now, the only one-eyed Christian I can think of offhand is Gordon Brown, who was our prime minister here. In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is prime minister, as I like to think of it. He was the man that caused the banking crisis from our point of view. Oh dear. And he was warned about it. But is that meant to be taken literally? And once we've got one statement like that where we're saying, well, are we meant to actually pull our eye out if we've seen something that we didn't like the look of, or would that be very sensible? And it probably wouldn't, which opens everything for interpretation. I very much take Joseph Campbell's point of view that mythology is not history, it's psychology.
Yeah.
And that the stories that are told in the Bible are of use to us morally to make certain determinations. And indeed, if you analyze the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, the Adam and Eve eat of the tree of the fruit of knowledge, and people usually end the name of the tree there, but it's knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
And so it's being said perhaps that among the animals, the human animal has said there is such a thing as good and evil. There is morality. And they then cover up their nakedness because they feel...
I think that's the point. How I see that is, it's not just about the knowledge of good and evil. It's about making judgments about good and evil. Animals don't do that. Apes don't do that. Somehow the human creature began to judge reality, began to weigh whether it's ethical or unethical, whether it's good meat or bad meat. But not only with their senses and instincts, but also with some other function, in awareness, and which we call judgment. And I think that the reason they were cursed, meaning no longer like the animals, had to leave Eden, is because human judgment is flawed, and it's still flawed. We have to constantly weigh how we assess things and make choices. I mean, our courts are full of this. Our history books are full of judgments about what history is. And there's always historians adjusting and changing how history is written. And, our philosophies are endlessly parsing reality and adjusting over the years. There's an argument still about who's right, Aristotle or Plato. It still goes on. And we're not like the animals in that sense. And that's the distinction, I think. When we ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we began to exercise judgment because of our larger brain and whatever else we had going for us. And that set us apart. That's what, we had to leave Eden. We had to leave that instinctual animal performance state and become this other creature. And we feel separate. We feel separate from that kind of reality. In fact, we would look back and make gods of these animals. We wore, eagle heads on when we danced in our rituals. There was the dog god in Egypt. There was the cat god in Egypt. There was, all of these animals are perfect. We're not perfect. We put on perfection by putting on the animal skin, by the shaman putting on the horns of the buffalo. That adds perfection, because we felt the animals are more perfect than us. They don't seem to sin and fail and do these crazy things we do.
Well, let's say that what's lost is harmony with nature through the loss of innocence.
Yeah.
And that, of course, gives us a capacity to create a mind that is more than one generation old, to create judgment that reaches back to Plato and Aristotle and even before them, and to have this collective wisdom that allows us to generate science on the one hand and art on the other. Another aspect of that is the amazing, the dream time for the Australian Aborigine, who associate themselves, every individual, with a particular species, and learn the secrets of that species, and you have this astonishing religious construction that comes out of it.
But you also get protection from the energy, the idea of the species, the totem animal, in other words.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Some kind of identity and some kind of protection.
Yeah, when then along came the European and violated all of those.
Brought his totem animal, which was disease and guns, and they couldn't fight that off.
Yeah.
I wanted to about this reality check, because regarding cult and interpreting the Bible literally, this brief story. I had a young man I met in New Mexico, and he had just returned from being part of the Way International. He had gotten into it in Ohio, and as he was around 19. And he had a disposition, probably a bipolar disorder, but he got quite excited by the whole thing, and was so excited he began to feel during the training with the Way International that he himself was infused with the Creator, with Jesus. And of course, that was going too far, so they kind of packed him up and put him in a hotel. Dayton, Ohio, and called his father to come get him. So in other words, cults do not like people that get a little bit too crazy or are non-deployable agents. They need them to be obedient and deployable, and he was getting a little far out. So at the hotel, he was thinking in his room, he said to me, and that he was going to prove to people he really was the Christ. So he took off all his clothes, because this is what he was told, to present himself fully naked. And he went down to the swimming pool area, and there were people out there looking astonished at this naked young man. And he announced he was Jesus and that he was going to prove it by walking across the water. And he said, I stepped out there in the deep end and I went to the bottom like a stone. And he said, I knew at that moment that I was not Jesus. Now, since that point, he got treatment and he was, somewhat lucid when I talked to him. It was almost 6 months after that incident. Back at home in New Mexico, when he was working for Sears as an assistant mechanic. But that story is very interesting. If you take something totally literally, like pluck your eye out, or like Oregon did, and he cut off his gonads, when he was young, right? Based on something, become a eunuch, for the sake of Jesus, type of thing. So, I think that story of that young man in the Way International illustrates how crazy this gets when you go beyond the psychological meaning, the mythological import of a scripture, and begin to make it literal. It becomes dangerous, and it's actually quite foolish in the long run.
I mean, I've recently been introduced to, I knew nothing about these guys, the Discordians.
Oh, yeah.
Thornley and Hill, who in the late 1960s were having a conversation one day, and one of them, I don't remember which, I think it was perhaps Hill, put forward the idea that all of human systems are an attempt to say that there is order in the universe. There is a God, or there are gods, or there is nirvana, or the Tao, or Ma'at, or whichever of the things we go for, science. And he said there isn't. Actually, the fundamental principle of the universe is discord. And so they adopted the Greek goddess Eris, the goddess of chaos, and they set about, and Spike will probably try and bleep this out, but I'm afraid they called it Operation Mindfuck.
Yeah.
And they launched this thing into the world. And one of the first ideas they got was they wanted to put forward a conspiracy theory that was completely ridiculous. They're Discordians. They want to have a kind of anarchic, humorous way. In fact, let's go off into one of the things that they did to explain this. Religious groups have prohibitions of diet. So if you're Jewish or Muslim, you don't eat pork. If you're Hindu, well, you generally don't eat meat, but you very especially don't eat any product that comes from the cow. There are vegetarian sects. Buddhism is, for the most part, vegetarian. There are all sorts of prohibitions, eating fish on Fridays, all sorts of things. So they decided that they needed one as well. So they set up this story that there'd been a day when Eris was invited to an Olympian banquet, but not allowed in. And so she was not given any buns for her hot dogs. And so Discordians do not eat hot dog buns. They can eat bread in any other form, but they do not eat hot dog buns. So this gives you some sense of, that they were, it started out as a very humorful idea. And one of the ideas they put forward, they'd found out about this Bavarian sect called the Illuminati. It was a sect that appears to have lasted for about 10 years. Its idea was to promote the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment in Bavaria. It fell apart and off it went. And so they went, oh, okay, we'll tell this story that they're actually part of a secret society that goes back to the beginning of time and that, is ruling the world now. And they started writing letters to Playboy magazine. 2 editors at Playboy magazine were later to become famous, Robert Wilson and Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea. I think those are their names. They were letter editors at Playboy. That was their job. They would shorten the letters down, put them in. And they read these letters and they picked up the idea of the Illuminati. And they wrote their trio of novels, Illuminatus, and the rest is fake history. So that we are now in a situation where this joke, which was put forward to be Discordian, to mess with people's minds, has really succeeded. So that now just about every conspiracy theory is leading back to this idea of, Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati having penetrated the founding fathers and created the Zionist government and all of these things.
Right, and put the eye of God on top of the pyramid.
They certainly did. E pluribus unum. And I read the Illuminatus in the mid-70s, late 70s.
Yeah, I looked into it back then, but I got bored with it for some reason. But I'm aware of it, from back then.
And from there we get things like the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, the idea that Jesus married Mary Magdalene and the Merovingian kings.
The Morning of the Magicians is another one.
Exactly. Pauls and Bergier, which leads us on to the Spear of Leviathan and all of these things, all of which fascinated me, and von Daniken, Velikovsky before him. All of these amazing ideas, which seem to come and go and swirl around, and out of them come belief systems. They become adopted, so that in QAnon, which is, I don't like the term new religious movement, but I'm quite happy to adopt the idea of belief systems without having to make them religious or movements or new. The QAnon has become a belief system which will presumably leave behind it some kind of cult, some kind of organized group.
I think it's already splintered. There are there are factions forming, so we can call them factions. Whether they become cults in their own right or new religions, it's a whole other ballgame. But well,
that's why I step aside from the word religion in particularly in new religious movement. I'm not really sure what they mean by new. The Encyclopedia Britannica tells me after Joseph Smith in 1830. Eileen Barker tells me after the Second World War. That's what the word new means. For me, it means something that's happened within my lifetime. So neither of those things would apply. And it's like the word is so often used in the arts, isn't it? Art Nouveau, the new art of the 1890s, Or in fact, in polyphony and polyphonic music, you have the ars antiqua and the ars nova. The ars nova are the 14th century, the new arts. So it's a dangerous, dangerous word, like modern and postmodern and postmodern and, I don't know where we're going to go from any of there.
Well, it's almost like the gender bifurcation going on. What are you early in your transition from male to female, and that makes you a specific person? Are you past the halfway point because you've done certain things to your body that makes you a different kind of a gender? I mean, it's become, because I work in a psych hospital where we get people that are having tremendous problems with this gender identification and going through hormone therapy and whatever, and that's become part of the language to respect the person in the way they view themselves. But the problem with that is the way they view themselves today, when you sign them into the hospital, could change the next day because of a conversation they had with somebody else in the hospital, and now they're moving back toward more male identity than female. I mean, it's the whole thing's kind of crazy in that sense. But I think that's true when you're talking about new and old religion. I mean, Art Nouveau is 120 years old?
Yeah. So it's aged art now. And, the Jugendstil, the young style.
The young style,
and on and on. So, I mean, on the point of gender discrimination, I think one of the important statements has been made in the last 10 years is by neurologists who are saying, whoops, the differences that we posited between the male and the female brain are not actually true. There is a brain. And I was reading an article, in fact, by a female neurologist who was saying it's a catastrophe that this differentiation has been taken, that in fact the differentiation between male and female may be tremendously overstated. And
well, you only have to look at the nipple. Why do men have nipples? I mean, the whole distinction becomes blurred right there.
Yeah, and women have their gonads on the inside, we have ours on the outside. Yes. But the gender of itself, it's one of those things. It's rather like race that I kind of hesitate at the word race. I think it's a racist word to suspect that there are races. It's like the word genocide coming from genus, which is even more.
I think the idea of race really, unfortunately, sprung out of Darwin's revolution about the species and what species are. And of course, people that want to see divisions between yellow, black, red, white peoples began to see them as species that shouldn't be mating. It's kind of like the horse and the donkey. When they mate, they have a mule which can't reproduce.
Oh, yeah.
And so forth. So I think that was appealing to people that have narcissistic tendencies as a culture to feel that they are other, they are separate, they are special people compared to those darker skinned or lighter skinned or different language speaking people. I guess it's almost human nature to feel a little bit afraid of what we don't know and what we're not like and what we don't understand. And I think that gets exaggerated by people that have a sense of wounded narcissism, meaning they're insecure inside and they need to blame the other for their insecure role in life, so they find targets, they make up a pecking order in their mind.
Yeah, and you have an in-group and an out-group, and
yes.
The elitism is the fundamental, is going back to, say, the Gnostics and their idea of the electoi, that we are the elect, we are the chosen people, we are the master race, we are, whatever the thing is.
Think of this too. I'm thinking back, you just reminded me of something. Think of Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, in his great trilogy, the Ring cycle. And he separates these warring separate peoples, the elves, the dwarves, the men, and then the orc and all of that going on. And then there's the magician, the sorcerer. And somehow these are very distinct peoples, like races,
yes.
But they come together and fight a common cause of evil. They have to have a Hitler, they have to have a Mussolini, they have to have something to fight against.
Saruman.
Yes. And but and you see a little bit of pairing going on, what Beyond would call a pairing assumption, where an elf falls in love with a man, or something like that. There is a little Romeo and Juliet going on, in these things, but that violates the traditions, So when we still live with this, the Asian in Korea falling in love with a Black American soldier is a big no-no, back in the day, right?
And in Vietnam, yeah.
Yes.
And then unless you take the kind of Shrek alternative, and it bothered me. I read The Lord of the Rings when I was 12, the first time I read them through, and again when I was 18. And I read them when I left Scientology when I was 28. And I suddenly saw something that really bothered me. And that was that getting that these are books, they're written by a hardcore Roman Catholic, who had insomnia. And that's what he did at night. He tried to create a new language because he was the world's leading expert on Old English of the middle part of England, the Mercian part of England, where I was born and grew up. there was nobody beyond him in his expertise, and he loved the Edda, the Icelandic stories, and he wanted really to generate a language which became Elvish. Yeah. And out of that came all of these quite remarkable stories. My problem was with the orcs, the Orcs, as they're called by the elves, Yuck, or the Uruk-hai, as in their stormtrooper SS mode. And the point is that they are to be exterminated. That was the thing that I suddenly got, that he's writing during World War II, and he is a right-wing human being by nature. He is most certainly nothing that could be called left-wing or socialist or liberal in his ideas as a human being. And he is designating a class of intelligent being capable of speech, capable of thought, and saying they're to be exterminated. And I suddenly saw the resonance. And I get into discussions with my friend Christian Sherko, who I've known for 30-something years, and he is the best of friends. And the only thing we disagree about, he's a Christian, I'm an agnostic. We can talk about the Bible and we're absolutely fine. The only thing we disagree about is the nature of the orc. He says, well, because they're a kind of robotic automaton creation, it's all right to, they're born forged in evil, and they cannot. And I believe in redemption. I
think you have a good point there, in that when you look at the classic example of the Nazi trying to create the pure race, and then having to get rid of those they consider impure, meaning gypsies, Jews, homosexual, the mentally ill, and aberrant Christians or whatever, that they also had a habit of illustrating these people to look like ugly things, like rats, like scowling and all of that, orcizing them, so to speak. Orcs are all ugly, aren't they? Their teeth are bad, their skin's bad, they got scars on their head. They don't have that perfect blue-eyed blonde look of the elf, and that elegance of and they don't have the kind of the comic stature of the dwarf or whatever, but there's something different about them that makes them ugly. And I think that's part of the aesthetics of all of this that we're talking about. The unreal is ugly, the real is beautiful.
Yeah.
In some people's mind, and so going back to Cy Twombly, changing the context of the mural made it ugly, right? Mm. And therefore that had to be changed back. You can't have ugly. Mm. Back in the 60s, when I was in college, a friend of mine who became a police commander in a major city in America later, we used to talk about this stuff, all the power things going on: black power, white power, gray power, female power. I mean, this thing was the whole idea of power. And he said, what we really need to have is ugly power. Nobody's talking about that. And, that doesn't fly, there used to be a thing that, a phrase back then that beauty is skin deep, but ugly is all the way. So you get this thing where people that are less attractive tend to get less good jobs, if they present themselves physically. People that are shorter tend to get less good jobs. People, women especially, if men will hire an attractive woman over a highly skilled man for the same job for one reason, because they like looking at them. Yep. And being around them and hoping maybe they can mate with them. I mean, this is an old game. So
I think
we're kind of trapped in our own psychology when it comes to this.
I think it's a really important point. Let me also say that in studying Tolkien's biography and letters, I never found anything anti-Semitic at all. So, I'm not making a direct comparison there.
Yeah, I don't think he consciously was othering any people. He was creating a mythological world, but his own psychology came out in it.
Yeah, and
It's interesting, you know.
And so it was. I mean, the problem of ugly was one that hit me in the 90s, you know, thinking about equalism, which is, you know, that's what I believe in, equalism, democracy, actual democracy, rather than these pale, bizarre imitations of it that we have in the Western world, which are all plutocracy, or they come out of corruption within labor movements. You know, it's one way or other, they're cacocracies. They are the rule of the worst most often. And it struck me thinking about in the 90s that, yes, these innate notions of what is attractive and not attractive. And I started thinking about uglyism, that there is a, you know, yeah, I'm 6 foot tall, I have a deep voice, so I'm more, you know, I'm fairly thin. I'm thin, let's face it. So I actually fit some of the criteria that are meant to advance one in the world. I'm white, I'm middle class, I've got all these things going for me.
You still got hair.
I still got hair. Incredible. In my ears as well, you know, as I progress in age. But how can we make that balance? How can we sort of, now I've skirted along the edge of it. I did a thing about beauty, which is on the channel somewhere, looking at ideas of female beauty, particularly, so, you know, Rubens and the Junoesque, Rembrandt, the wonderful Arnolfini Marriage by Van Eyck, one of the great paintings, where, of course, the woman has a big stomach. And it's not because she's pregnant. It's because at that time, women with very high foreheads, very, you know, the hairline way back, and large stomachs and small breasts were considered to be, absolutely gorgeous. And then we got the Victorian culture where women would be wearing bustles to make their bums look immense. And, you know, the hourglass figure with the very large breasts of the Edwardian period, then the flappers, young women who looked like young men, and all of these cultural constructs, which are like, you know, the context in which the Sire Twombly is seen, that the generation moves somehow to accept, you know, and after the airbrush was first used in graphic art by Man Ray, possibly. He claimed that, so that we got Vargas, and we could actually now manipulate the form to make these supposedly perfect forms, which I think the internet and internet porn has perhaps done something about. You know, the kind of readers' wives section that we are, where initially pornography went the Playboy route. And remember, this is where the Illuminati came from. Went the Playboy route of, you know, these completely artificial creatures who had no pubic hair and, you know, were a particular shape, and they had perfect skin because the airbrush had been applied. That we are now coming perhaps to a more real version of what naked people look like. Even then, they can't walk across a swimming pool, you know. We have to watch for that. But the whole sense of, you know, a kind of group of people holding something to be true that is simply accepted. You know, that when I look back to Rembrandt's paintings of Saskia, who I don't find attractive, and then of Henrika Sterfels, who I do find attractive, there's something, but it reminds me, I went around an Andrew Wyeth's show. I'm a huge fan of Andrew Wyeth, just amazing, brilliant man.
I live in Wyeth country.
There you go. And that's
about 30-minute drive from the Wyeth Museum.
Oh, wonderful. I'll come and see you then, definitely. But there was a show in LA of paintings that he'd done. He'd had a long-term relationship with a woman who was a maid.
Yes.
At his friend's house, and it had been kept secret. And he'd painted all of these pictures of her. And I went round the show with a friend of mine who was a woman in her 70s, very cultured, you know, belonged to the LA Operatic Society, or what, you know, she was part of the society in LA, and a really, really fine woman. We went around this show, and at the end of it, she just said, "Why did he paint pictures of such an ugly woman?"
Oh.
And I said, "He painted pictures of love. That's what I saw."
Yes.
And that sort of sense, you know, that the idea that you not only can you be born poor in this world and disadvantaged in that way, but you can be born, you know, that generations of the wealthy have married into the beautiful and created the moronic, you know, in the next generation. People who are generally, you know, half and half. They won't be smart and they won't be pretty, you know, and that those become the trust fund babies that then have the political influence generation upon generation. But that,
you know, there was this thing. It was just published recently about a lot of Trump's kind of Nazi or fascist statements. You know, he believes in his genetic pool, that it's superior. And he does, and his son believes in that too, that they are superior people because of their genes. And he brings that up, you know, when he says Norwegians are more favorable to come to the U.S. than those shithole nations that he talked about in Africa and South America. You know, he firmly believes that kind of thing, almost a eugenic appeal to reality. And you also reminded me that there's both a necessary and a dangerous side to cult formation, which has been going on forever, where group cohesion allows for both individual and group growth in a more powerful and elegant way. You know, if you have a communal effort in farming, you get a lot more done than if you're doing it out there individually. I mean, that's where it started, I think, in many ways. And also in combat, you know, you're better off as a group than you are as an individual fighting off a foe. And so organizing and becoming a cult or a culture or whatever is more favorable than hanging out there all by yourself, trying to do everything and invent the wheel by yourself and whatever, you know. So there's a good side to that, but it also flips into a danger when that group becomes psychologically closed about what it is and how special it is, and then becomes a dominant group that overtakes other groups and wants to swallow them up. Kind of like, you know, again, recently Nazi Germany wanting to swallow up all of Europe and become the dominant Reich, especially among anyone that was close to being Germanic or Caucasian looking. So I think, you know, we have to be careful that the reason cults form is because of an instinct for self-preservation within group preservation. It's ancient, you know, and we can easily get misguided by it and misled by people that want to use that instinct in us against us. You know, I think like Hubbard was genius at bringing some people into that sense of being you know, you can figure yourself out, you can become a perfected person within a perfected system, and therefore we can perfect the entire universe. I mean, that's how he was thinking, right?
Yeah, and look where that went.
Yes, yeah. So it becomes it is something which I think is necessary in a sense for human development. At the same time, it's a dangerous point of departure when it's not managed well. W.R. Bion called it the difference between a kind of group that has a basic assumption state, like Scientology did, as opposed to a working group, which tends to look outside itself in order to improve itself and is willing to change, you know, kind of like the US government is set up to do, to set up amendments, to make changes when necessary and bring in justice as time goes on, to avoid totalitarianism. Whereas a cult tends to veer toward totalitarianism, and I think that's where the mistake is, because imperfection then becomes grandiose, and then it becomes dangerous.
It's true. I mean, my focus has shifted. You know, I'm always trying to redefine what I'm thinking so that I can better explain it to myself and then to other people. And I've come to certain simple concepts. One of them is to be anti-authoritarian, where authoritarianism is those people who believe that they should be in charge, that they are superior, or bullies, and their followers, which is about 60% of the population anywhere you go. And that's the balance that needs to be tipped if we're to have. My other slogan is pro-democracy, which I've adopted from the people in Hong Kong. And I do not believe in left or right when it comes to democracy. There is a centre, which is that we should all have a say, and that in Switzerland it's proved possible that you can have a group where everybody has a say. They still haven't managed to deal with the problem of authoritarianism there. They're still one of the largest arms brokers in the world. But then I live in a country that's one of the largest arms producers in the world, and you live in another. And both of them are on the Security Council, the Permanent Security Council of the United Nations, along with the other three major arms producers. There are ironies. But I've come to this simple view that if you have a group that doesn't work in an authoritarian way, that does work in a consensus way, then it is positive. And there are a lot of examples through history, but we found two in prehistory, which are really quite fascinating. One is the Indus Valley civilization, which flourished for 700 years without having fought a war. There are no weapons found there. They had fortifications on their southern border. But they also don't have any temples and they don't have any palaces. It would appear that they had some kind of equality in their society, and that the society lasted for 700 years is quite remarkable. More recently, work is coming out of the Ukraine, which is sadly having some problems at the moment because of its big neighbor, its big bullying neighbor. But in not mentioning any names, the bear that keeps coming into the garden and stealing things. But in the Ukraine, there would also appear for a fairly long period of time to have been an egalitarian society, showing that human beings are capable of living together. And I would aver that what goes wrong is when the tyrants, the dictators, the kings and queens, the rulers take power. And in times of warfare, where that becomes necessary, that there should be strict command and things need to be done in a certain way, those leaders then take over. And our society, our civilization, so-called, derives from the same place that Judaism came from, Sumeria, as I think Joseph Campbell and others pretty well showed. But there were these other cultures, and there still are.
You bring up, I was reading recently on ancient Aboriginal history in Australia. That goes back 40,000 years.
Yeah.
Relatively war-free.
Yeah.
And they had ritual war where they didn't really kill people, or it rarely happened. They would have feuds and disputes, but they would work them out in a much better way than we do today. So in that sense, they had a clear ethical idea of what it meant to be a human being and socially viable and whatever else they were doing. And also they were quite advanced at farming and managing land.
Yeah.
Part of the reason I read that the British felt that they could overtake all of them is that these people were hunter-gatherers and they didn't really own land. They just moved around all the time, and therefore the British had the right, or the invader had the right, to take over the land as they willed, and any semblance of the management of land was completely run over.
Yep.
And these people were shoved out because of their inferior weapons. They couldn't defend themselves. And again, susceptibility to disease, much like the American experiment.
And the performance of genocide in Tasmania by
that was awful.
The British government.
Yeah, I've got to wrap this up in a bit. But going back to Cy Twombly and this changing the environment changes the art idea. I'm wondering with some groups, they try to change the environment by propaganda. by showing that they're not what their enemies and critics are saying they are, and then in fact the critic is flawed.
Yes.
Make the critic look like a criminal, which is a classic Scientology tactic, but it's also classic in politics. To make the liberal look evil. All liberals look like Stalin and Lenin, for instance, among the rabid right, and everyone on the rabid right looks like Hitler. They should be having little mustaches, right? And so this dialogue keeps going on. But if you can create a different environment around your enemy, your foe, you can make him look uglier.
Yeah.
And therefore dismiss him, much more easily. And I just I don't know how we're going to combat this. I mean, it seems like the internet has become almost a chaotic ebb and flow of a struggle for reality and sensible reality, because it's constantly being attacked and changed. And I personally don't know where it's going. It's like kind of like the gun culture in the United States. It's become so embedded. There was a recent survey done by Michael Smerconish last week on his show that asked, the simple question, and I'm paraphrasing, are we going to have to live with mass shootings in the United States? There's no end to it. And the sentiment was of many, many thousands of people that voted in, about 80% of Americans felt we're just going to have to live with it. We can't change this. We're done. That's it. Now the 20% feel we can, and there's some hope there. But the fact that a fully 80% feel that this is just us. We've got too many guns, and any mentally ill person can easily buy one, or any hate-filled person can easily find one. There's no restriction here. In fact, the black market in guns is even more lively than the controlled store market. Where they have some reality checks for who buys these things. So it's out of control, and I think a lot of people are just resigned here. That's how we're going to have to live.
Yeah, and that's a terrible thing. And it brings us to cult and culture, that we've had one school shooting, Dunblane. You have one every 2 weeks.
It seems like that lately, yeah. And in fact, people stopped counting. They don't remember the last one because the current one takes up news, and then you forget the last one. Yep. Except for a few like Columbine, and a few of these stand out in people's minds. But even then, they forget the name of it and who the shooter was, because there's so much of it going on. Yeah.
So once you can say one culture has this and another culture has that, the US has a lot of mass shootings. They're going on all of the time. You also have a huge amount of serial killers. No other country comes close. How much of this is wrapped up in the propaganda? How much of this is wrapped up in the expectation created by the media? I know that both the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association have pleaded with media not to report particularly things like celebrity suicides, because it's known that the copycat effect will happen. After 9/11, there were a number of instances where planes were crashed into buildings around the world. There are these strange, we're not going to get into morphogenetic fields here because I don't believe in it, but the idea that something spreads through a culture. I live in a place where we have only 3 armed police forces of our 41 police forces. One of them, in fact, where I live, Manchester, Nottingham and London. And you do not see police officers with guns. If you wanted to get a gun in this country, you could. There is a black market. There was a rise in gun crime. We're now seeing quite a lot of knife crime, which is new. But how much of this becomes part of the culture, and how much of it is the acceptance of it? That if the NRA, which if we're to use the word cult group, I think we might use it about the NRA, is going to have political power And the idea that politicians, I remember when John Kerry was standing for president, somebody one day, having voted as against the gun lobby repeatedly, somebody presented him with a gun publicly. And he said he would shoot some gobbles with it. I remember his word, because it was somewhere between gobbler for turkey and Goebbels, you know, very odd. But it was sort of, I just watched a great movie, a 1948 movie called State of the Union with Spencer Tracy and Catherine Hepburn and Angela Lansbury. And it really rocked me because 1948, they're making all of the statements about politics that I would make now, and the corruption in politics, and they're talking about the Democrats and the Republicans and saying, we need a politics that doesn't represent the interests of the leaders of the labor unions or of the rich. We need a politics that represents the people. And I personally have not lost hope. I think it is possible to restrict at least assault weapons, not just bump stocks, and make the availability of these things less. Of course, people will always be able to make explosives, I'm afraid, because the chemicals are easy to put together. But more so to change the culture, more so to look at what sort of illness somebody like Elliot Rodger, the La Vista killer, what they're suffering from and how our society might help these people in a better way.
You know, there's a heroic struggle going on to try to fix the psychology of human beings, the illness that we carry.
Yeah.
And of course, Freud and before Freud, but it exploded, the sense of exploring what makes us tick and how to fix us. You know, and we've tried all kinds of crazy things from electroshock therapy, which was horrible in the early days. Now it's useful because they've learned how to manage it.
And it's used in perhaps 2% of the amount.
Yeah, it's very small. I've talked to patients that have had it done, and it was the only thing that knocked them out of their depression.
Yeah.
You know, and it worked for them. And again, it doesn't work permanently, but it lasted for a year or two.
Yeah,
which is a lot better than swallowing medication all the time.
Yeah, and being associated.
So and LSD. Robert Kennedy said his wife, who was mental problems, Ethel, I believe her name was, had an LSD therapy session back in the '60s, early '60s, and it worked for her. It pulled her out of her illness for quite a while, and he was an advocate of not. Of research in that field because he saw what happened to his wife, at least for a period of time. So now we're catching up with that. There is more research going on with that kind of drug, psilocybin and K2 and LSD, to see if it can help certain people. But it's a small percentage. It's not going to be everybody.
And it's not taking it every weekend, because when you look at what happened to John Lilly and Timothy Leary, they went completely mad.
Well, yeah, they were mad, I think, to start with. In a sense.
I think they were, but it made it worse. And so
made it worse. So, but this is the pushback from the pharmaceutical industry is that they're a little bit wary of this, because if you can give someone an 8-hour treatment with a very cheap dose of a drug that they no longer need to use and repeat for 2 years.
Where's the money going to go?
Where's the money? There isn't any there. In fact, they can pick the mushroom from the woods and be in a clinical setting and have a great therapeutic experience and overcome their depression and their addiction or whatever they have, which is proven in some cases. But there's no money in it.
Well, I mean, it took 20 years to fund to actually permit the first study of the use of MDMA, or ecstasy, it's also known, for post-traumatic stress disorder. And the results were so astonishingly positive that the FDA actually fast-tracked the second study. Yeah. And we are in this place, but it is important to say that this is used as therapy. In Germany for 2 decades now, they've used ketamine coma.
Yeah.
But you'll get a 5-day coma if in treating severe depression, which I personally would advocate before using ECT, because ECT will cause damage no matter what good it causes.
You get memory loss at the very least. For a while.
And it will burn out brain cells. There's structural damage that's caused.
Not enough, they regenerate. It's okay.
Yeah, but the point is that brain cells regenerate, but what those brain cells were specifically doing doesn't regenerate once they're killed. So, I'm not against it in restricted use. I mean, I read the chief enemy of Scientology in the UK was the psychiatrist William Sargent, who introduced electroconvulsive therapy. And I campaigned against ECT. I interviewed people, I read about it, and it was being used very promiscuously, as I'm sure we both agree. But Sargent explained that the only reason he'd introduced it was because they did not have the funding for the beds in the mental hospitals. They had to empty them out. And this would give you 6 months to a year of memory loss, where the person was no longer connected to what it was that had been distressing them. So, reasons for. But yeah, I mean, it's a whole other area of exploration. Seeing that cannabis is now being legalized gradually. In my country, not at all. You can still go to prison for 14 years for intent to supply cannabis in this country. The police don't really want to prosecute. But we're now, when I go into the village where I live, the pharmacy, the druggist, has a big poster advertising cannabis.
Yes.
As CBD. It doesn't say anything about cannabis. It's advertising cannabidiol reduced to CBD, which you can now sell for insomnia. Now, for 2,500 years, medical manuals have carried this as a cure for insomnia. It's been demonstrated that cannabis is effective against pain and has none of the problems that the opiate and opioid groups have. But it would appear that in the 1880s, when it became popular to inject things, cannabis is not water soluble. It was difficult to break it down, though it was one of the drugs that Eli Lilly and the pharmaceutical companies put in everything until the late 1930s. So we're seeing this strange thing where another aspect of culture is changing, that we're realizing that not only has nobody come up with any negative evidence against cannabis in all of this time, there is no reason for it to be prohibited. You can think of reasons for cocaine and heroin.
Well, in THC in itself, the active ingredient,
Delta 9 THC,
it's euphoric, and it has caused problems in terms of, your intelligent quotient goes down with constant use and all of that. But I'm talking about the street use of it, not the medical use.
I'm very suspicious. That's the New Zealand study.
No, I took a test myself back in the early 70s, stoned, taking the whole battery of hours of tests.
I'm sure, but
it diminished my ability to function about 10 to 15%.
Yeah, when you are stoned, but when you are under the influence of any euphoric, it will change. And you can then look to state dependence, for example, with alcohol, where people are quite drunk and they are taught to cook a recipe, and when they are sober, they can't cook it, but when they're drunk, they can. So state dependence has to be added in. The only valid study I can think of, which is a study rather than anecdote, forgive me, is a New Zealand study where they monitored teenagers who were stoners. And they basically, in the developmental phase, it did seem to have some detrimental effect. But when compared with alcohol, used at the same level by teenagers, forget it. Alcohol will
I agree there.
With brain development, with stomach development. So it's the lesser of two evils there.
Yeah.
But for the most part, as a drug, it can't kill you. It's not actually addictive. You don't get withdrawal symptoms if you stop using it. Cannabis psychosis is caused by taking 80 to 100 times the normal dose. Try doing that with wine. And you then have there is some suggestion that bowel cancer may be made worse by cannabis. It's being tested in Israel right now, and we should have results soon. But outside of that, it appears to be beneficial for CBD appears to be beneficial for bipolar disorder, and a lot less dangerous than lithium carbonate in terms of what it will do. Delta 9 THC is effective against pain, and everything is dosage, isn't it? It's how much of it you use, how often you use it. If you're stoned all day, then your cognitive function will not be good.
It's also complicated. I've noticed that probably close to a third of the patients that come into our hospital, maybe, well, more than half use cannabis. Speaking, but about, I'm going to go more conservative, say 20% are carrying cannabis cards. In other words, CBD oil cards or something where they can buy it legally, and they have an ID picture and all of that. So among the people diagnosed with mental illness, it's a very popular alternative that's being prescribed now by some of the physicians treating them. One, it might be benign and not harmful in its effects. It might not be as helpful as they imagine it is. I don't know. The studies are still out there. But it's become very common where I work. To see it around.
I mean, the gateway effects and the sort of things like that. One of the statements that's made about schizophrenia is, what percentage of schizophrenics use tobacco, would you say?
More than half.
I've heard it's way up there in the 90s.
It's probably because they manage their moods by substance use sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
And that could be marijuana, that could be alcohol, that cigarettes are common. You're right. It's not on. We get someone from the streets that hasn't had treatment for a while and has schizophrenia. Their pockets are full of cigarette butts, and they're just completely disorganized. They have feces in their pants. They're that out of reality.
Yeah.
By the time they come into hospital sometimes, and it takes time to clean them up and get them back on track. And cigarettes are a big part of what I see. Yeah. Yeah.
And I would say that, in this country, when we started to liberalize and change the classification of cannabis briefly, there was an alarming meta-analysis done at Bristol, which said that those who were going to suffer from schizophrenia would develop symptoms 5 years earlier if they used cannabis. And
our doctors are saying the same thing, that it's both cannabis, LSD, the euphoric type of drugs can unmask a potential, for that disorder earlier. Yeah. In many people. I got to get going.
Well, let me just put in a statistic to be lest our viewers be worried. That means that 1 in 7,000 people should be worried about the use of Delta-9 THC.
Right. Right.
And it different horses for different courses. That we should be sensible, and we advise that you don't use any drugs at all at home, except for this, which is water. Which is
the drink of the gods.
The drink of the gods, the ambrosia. Always such an incredible pleasure. We'll talk again in a few weeks or what have you.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. And enjoy your day.
Yeah, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Joe. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.